Workbook 5 is in fact the last stage. It's not a very big workbook. Compared to Workbook 4, there is less material for you to learn in it. It's about government budgeting and the linkage to accounting. Quite a lot of that has already been discussed, but this will finish and complete that. So we'll look at the public sector budget, we'll look at the budget process, we'll look at the budget documents, and we will look at the requirement under the cash basis IPSAS to prepare a comparison between the budget and the actual outcome, the accounts of after the year is finished. That's a requirement in the cash basis IPSAS and in the accrual IPSAS, but at the moment we're just looking at the cash basis IPSAS. So the first area is the public sector budget. As I say, we've already discussed that in some detail on the legal nature of the budget. Most public sector entities prepare annual budgets, including governments. Within each country, there will be constitutional procedures for enactment which are specific to each country. In the next module in your course, PFM for Somaliland, we'll look at the particular constitutional and legal requirements in Somaliland, but they fit in with a general international pattern. And budgets are normally public documents. It is in fact a requirement of the IMF Code on Fiscal Transparency that budgets should be published. So it is a requirement, an international requirement, that budget should be published, and most countries do publish their budgets. The budget serves multiple purposes. It allocates resources to achieve policy goals. In other words, if the policy is, for example, to improve primary education, the budget will allocate additional resources to primary education. If the objective is to improve health in a general sense, then there will be more funds allocated to the health sector. So the first thing it does is to allocate resources according to policy goals, and obviously within the constraints that you have, of which the major one is the next one, fiscal constraints. So the second thing is it's a tool of fiscal planning. In the budget you set out your taxation policies, how much tax you're going to raise from different sources and the levels of taxation. You'll set out your expenditure plans, which is the linkage back to allocating resources. And any difference, for most countries it will be a shortfall that you'll want to spend more than you raise in taxes and other revenues, how you're going to fund that through borrowings from different sources. So the second purpose of a budget is it's a tool for fiscal planning. Thirdly, it enables the controlling and monitoring of expenditure. By setting expenditure limits, ceilings if you like, in your budget, you then have a basis on which you can control the expenditure against those budget ceilings and monitor how they're achieved. And finally, do remember that the budget authorizes revenue raising. Normally the budget will set the tax rates, the tax laws for the forthcoming period. So it legally authorizes those taxes. Very important, therefore, it's fundamental to public sector management. What are the stages in the budget process? Now, this is a diagram that is not in your workbook, but it will be in the handout that I send to you, because I think it explains it in more detail. The government has certain policy goals. They will vary from between governments. There will usually be a number of different goals. They may be set out in a document. It may have been just made informally in speeches by a political leader. But governments will always have policy goals. And they will subdivide into fiscal goals. How much does the government want to borrow? How much tax is it going to raise? Not saying exactly where it will be spent, but just in broad terms, the level of taxation, the level of expenditure, the level of borrowing, and sector goals. How much do you want to spend on education? Do you want to focus on primary, secondary, or tertiary education on particular geographic areas? And those goals will be documented, or should be documented, the fiscal goals in a fiscal strategy paper, and the sector goals in sector strategies. and those will be combined into a medium-term expenditure framework, which is something we won't go into at this stage, but it's a linking of your fiscal and your policy goals. And that leads to the annual budget. Now, everything above the annual budget will be studied in PFM for Somaliland. We're not going to go into those areas of fiscal strategy, sector strategies, medium-term expenditure frameworks in the introductory course. We will just focus on the annual budget. So you should be aware of the other stages in an ideal budget preparation process, but we're not going to go into them at this stage and for this examination. The budget stages. This is based on the table in your workbook, but I've slightly simplified 1 and 2 there. Because really they belong to the stages we're not going to study. They belong to the prior stages in that previous diagram. If I go back, they really belong to the stages which will be studied in PFM for Somaliland. So 1 and 2, they're the budget, sector allocations and priorities determined from fiscal strategy and sector strategies. And that should happen well in advance in the budget. All of that process should be complete 6 months before the start of any fiscal year, at least 6 months before. So your general strategies should be set well in advance. Then you issue what are called budget call circulars. The name varies from country to country, but these are budget instructions which would come from either planning or the Ministry of Finance, depending on a particular country, to line ministries saying, these are the priorities, this is the amount of money that you have available. Very important that, because that gives the framework within which the individual ministries will prepare their budget estimates. And then the line ministries, health, education, communications and so on, will each obtain subsidiary estimates from subsidiary units. Under any ministry, take a Ministry of Health for example, there will be various hospitals, health centres and so on, all of which will have their own requirements. So the Ministry of Health will gather those estimates together and in 5 consolidate them into the budget estimates. And ideally that should be 5 months before the start of the fiscal year. So we're now talking about round about this month. If you're budgeting now for 2018, by now you should have, or be in the last stage of preparing your ministry estimates, which are then sent to the Ministry of Finance. So these are estimates from the individual ministry saying how much they want. Theoretically, those Theoretically, those should be within the expenditure ceilings that were set in the budget call circular in 3. In practice, what happens is ministries say they want more than they were allocated and will submit higher estimates. So then in 7 you go through a process of budget review and negotiation between the Ministry of Finance, the Planning Ministry and the line ministries. That goes on in 7, so that by 3 months before the start of the financial year, by we're talking about October, you should be submitting to the Parliament your budget for the year. That should be within your fiscal limits. It should have been agreed with the individual line ministries. And it then goes through a parliamentary review process. How that works is different in different countries. In some countries, the UK for example, although there's a lot of discussion about the budget, it is never changed in Parliament unless the government agrees to changes. In other countries, the Philippines would be an example, there are extensive changes by Parliament, so the budget that emerges after parliamentary review is completely different to the one submitted by government. So exactly how that review process works and to the extent to which it changes the budgets depends on each individual country. Finally, the budget is enacted as law, which should happen at least a month before the start of the financial year. And then once that's done, the budget's allocated to spending units, and we go through the process of budget execution and budget environments, which you've already considered in Workbook 4. So that is those are the budget stages and the approximate timing of when they should take place in relation to any country's fiscal year. Quite easy, of course, in Somaliland because your fiscal year is the calendar year. And this table is also based on the table that is in your workbook, but I have reorganized it and tried to simplify it. So this says the same thing as in your workbook, but it's organized and presented somewhat differently, and I hope in a way that makes it clearer. What I've done is I've looked at the stages and looked at the features in relation to the different stages. So in relation to budget processes, what you want, first of all, those procedures we saw in the previous slide should be simple, they should be well documented. Nobody should be in any doubt about how the budget process will work. There should be documentation setting it out very clearly. And secondly, the resource ceilings should be identified by sectors and organisations. Again, we said this is the result of your fiscal policy. You should say how much each ministry has to spend, and that should be clearly sent out to the ministry before they're asked to prepare their estimates. And the third point is there should be political involvement and commitment. Sometimes budget preparation is regarded as a technical process and politicians keep out of it. It's actually of fundamental importance because it says how the money will be spent. And the last point is an important one, and one we'll again talk about more later in your studies. When there's a development project, you have the costs of it. For example, if you decide to build a new hospital, you will have a cost of building the hospital. But once the hospital is built, there will then be ongoing costs of medical staff, administrative staff, building maintenance. So when you have any sort of development project, any capital expenditure, you should in your budget take account not only of the capital costs involved, but also of the ongoing recurrent costs that building will create. One country which I know had a big problem with this was Sri Lanka. At one stage, Sri Lanka had a large number of very expensive public buildings, hospitals, schools, for example, but it had no money to staff them or maintain them because nobody had thought about the recurrent costs and how they were going to fit into future budgets. So it is a very important point to look at the recurrent costs of development projects. Okay, and then the second group of features of good budgeting relate to budget presentation. Understandable. Budget documents are not just intended for technical, highly skilled specialists such as yourselves. They are intended for the citizens of your country. And they should be understandable by any literate, intelligent person. They should not use jargon. They should be clear and well organized. Budgets should be comprehensive. They should include all revenues, expenditures and borrowings. In many countries, a real issue is that a number of important items of expenditure and revenues and borrowings are kept off budget. They are not shown in the budget documents. So that the government sometimes might have large borrowings from some international organisation, private or public international organisation or group of individuals to fund some special activity, and all of that might be not shown in the budget. And that's wrong. One of the most important features of a budget is it should be comprehensive. It should include all public revenues, expenditures and borrowings. And the third feature is that there should be some sort of output indicator. Simple ones. If you build a hospital, how many patients do you expect to go through the hospital? So simple output indicators should also be a feature of your budget. And the third group of features of good budgeting relate to the execution of the budget. One of the problems is to combine flexibility with control over expenditure. You set expenditure limits in your budget, but sometimes events happen. A drought, for example, which requires extra expenditure to support members of the population. You should have the flexibility in the budget to respond to those emergencies without losing overall control of your expenditure. And where there are changes to the budget, such as the drought we just mentioned, then the impact on the budget should be analysed and the changes clearly justified. You should try to minimise the use of supplementary budgets, environments in fact. Generally, you should try to get your budget as far as possible right in the first place, so you don't need supplementary budgets, environments. And if there are breaches of budget rules and regulations, then there should be penalties. People should be made to pay for those, which is linked to the accountability of senior managers. You don't want a culture of fear where nobody will make any decision because they're afraid of the consequences, but you do want people to be accountable for the actions they take, and there to be penalties if they clearly breach the rules. And as far as possible, your budget should be as close as possible to what actually happens. You shouldn't forecast revenues which are 20% above the amount that you actually get. A 2 or 3% error is acceptable, but errors above 5% indicate that you've got something wrong with your budget process. And finally, reporting. There should be prompt reporting of budget variations and outcomes, which leads you into the accounting and the requirement for an accounting system which reports not just at the end of the year, but as the year progresses on the budget execution. But of course, many countries, most countries actually, sadly, have weakness in their budget process. One would be the point we just mentioned, there are persistent large differences between the budget and the outturn. The budget that's passed bears no relationship to what actually happens in some countries. It's just a paper exercise, it means nothing. A second problem is poor budget documentation, where the budget documents are incomplete, can't be understood, the figures don't agree with each other sometimes. Poor budget documentation. A third weakness is there's inadequate linkage between resource forecasts and budget allocations. Ministries should be in total spending resources which reflect the resources that are forecast to be available. There should be a clear linkage between these. A fourth weakness is in the preparation of budget, that the organisational control of the budget is not clearly identified. Who does what in the budget process? Which comes on to 5, overall inadequate budget processes. The process of preparing the budget is just not well organised. 6, timeliness of the budget. I'll go back to the Philippines again. In the Philippines, at one stage, in say 2015, they still had not passed the 2013 budget. Never mind 2014, they were still arguing about the 2015 budget. The whole budget process had completely collapsed because of the inability to agree budget, and the government was keeping going by emergency funding all the time. Control over environments, we've talked about these in Workbook 4. There must be some controls. You just can't keep moving money around as you want to. There must be limits on how much can be moved, what types of movements, who can authorise it. And that again leads to 8, inadequate procedures for managing the budget would be a major weakness of the budget process. So those are all things that you can see, and have a look at what happens in Somaliland. I'd like to be able to say that in Somaliland the budget process is strong and none of those things happen, but it's not something that we have as yet studied. And this table summarises the various budget issues and how you would overcome them. So budget's not available at the start of the year. What you need is good planning of the budget process. You plan and identify the time at which each of those stages that we looked at earlier on is going to take place, so they're all complete in good time for the budget to be available at the start of the financial year. Lack of information on current revenues and expenditures. What you do need when you're preparing the budget is to know how you're progressing with the current year's budget. Obviously, if you start preparing the budget now in July, you won't know the outcome for the year, but you should have information what's happened for the first 6 months of the year. You should have up-to-date information on where you've got to. You should know the commitments that have been made, so you should be able to make a good forecast of where you're going to be at the end of 2017. And that information should be available to line ministries now. A third issue is the line ministries don't properly prepare their budgets. That's very common, and a common complaint by ministries of finance and planning ministries is the inadequacy of the process in the line ministries. It's often an excuse for centralising things in a Ministry of Finance. But that's not the correct solution. The correct solution is to have well-documented procedures to be observed by the line ministries. Training. You need to train not just people in the Ministry of Finance, but people in all of your ministries on how to prepare the budgets. And rewards for good budget preparation, I don't mean rewards in terms of prizes. What I mean is that the ministries that have good, well-documented, detailed budgets should see that they do better in terms of getting resources allocated than those ministries which are disorganised. And an example of that would be estimates of lack of detailed backup and analysis, or excessive initial estimates, where line ministries just produce very large requirements without any detail of why they want them. These all are a matter of procedures, training, and ensuring that those who do it properly are in fact rewarded in terms of their budget allocation. Another failure is the failure to allocate resources to spending units. Budgets passed by Parliament usually will not specify the funds down to the lowest level of government. They will stop at usually one level below the ministry level. But those funds have to be sub-allocated to the individual primary schools, health clinics, and so on. And that's a task that has got to be done as soon as the budget is enacted, so that at the start of the year, every unit within government knows how much money it's got available and can get access to that. We've already mentioned the use of varmints and supplementary budgets. They are necessary, but they should be minimised. And weak expenditure control. Again, it's a matter of commitment management and strong budget execution procedures. Now, all of these tables are based on those that you've got in your workbook, but as I say, I have reorganised and simplified them. There's nothing in here that is not in your workbook, but I think you may find these a rather simpler way of remembering the information. Your workbook also refers to bottom-up and top-down budgeting, and this diagram, I think, perhaps explains what we mean by that. Top-down budgeting is what you would expect to find in probably most countries, certainly at an early stage in organising their financial management. You have central determination of fiscal resources, which leads to budgets which are allocated to ministries, departments and agencies. Those are sometimes called resource envelopes. Use of the English language, the word envelope in this sense means a wrapper of the amount of money that you've got available. So don't get confused if you see the term resource envelopes. It means resource ceilings, expenditure ceilings. And then the ministries, departments and agencies allocate their resources within the budget ceilings. That's top-down budgeting, and what you would normally expect to be introduced as the first stage of setting up a strong system. The alternative approach is bottom-up budgeting, where you start at the bottom, where the ministries, departments, agencies decide what they need, their resource requirements. Those are consolidated up through ministries and submitted, and then you use a negotiating process to try to keep those requirements within the overall fiscal resources. In practice, most countries use some sort of mixture of top-down and bottom-up budgeting. But generally speaking, say, early stages of implementing strong financial management systems, the emphasis will be on top-down budgeting so as to ensure fiscal management of the country. The budget documents. Let me just go back and say a little bit before I go into the detail. There are a number of publications which set out standard lists of budget documents. We will go through those in more detail later on in your studies and what the requirements are. But at this stage, we're just going to look at the major budget documents. Generally speaking, there are four groups of budget documents. First of all, you will have a budget speech, normally made by the Minister of Finance, which will be published as a paper setting out the fiscal goals, the macroeconomic assumptions, and the policies. The general statement of where the government is and what it's trying to achieve in the budget. And then you'll get the detailed budget proposals, which will be usually annexed to the budget speech, which will show the revenues, the taxes and other revenues that are going to be your sources of income, your expenditure proposals, analysing using these different budget classifications, which we've discussed earlier on in the course. And those should be compared with both the current year estimates. Say if you're producing that in September, say of 2017, you don't have the final figures for the year 2017, but you should have estimates of where you expect to be at the end of 2017, and also the previous year, the actual outcome for 2016. And ideally, they should include non-financial performance indicators. Now, the expectation is that the infant mortality rate will drop from X to Y. The aim is that 80% of children in the age range 5 to 8 will be in education. Those sort of performance indicators. There should also be a fiscal strategy paper. This should be published, explaining the deficit financing, where you're going to raise money from, how you're going to borrow it, what interest rates you expect to pay, together with medium-term fiscal forecasts, not just for the current year, but for 3-4 years into the future, showing your expenditures, expected revenues, expenditures, and level of borrowings. And finally, there should be financial reports, or if you like, financial statements, showing the previous year outturned. If you're using cash accounting, there should also be a statement of liabilities, loans and assets, fiscal risks, contingent liabilities, and long-term commitments. Now, we haven't gone into some of these as yet, and you don't really need to know them in any detail. Fiscal risks is an area we certainly haven't explored. Financial liabilities, I think everybody will be familiar with, and long-term commitments we have discussed. But those are the things you would expect your financial reports to include. That summary, if you had all of those, then you would meet most of the international requirements for budget information. Budget presentation, again, I've simplified this from what's in the workbook, which really shows your total cash flow projection, whereas the budget presentation actually is really a bit simpler than that, and this is a simplified format. It's all you need to know. And it shows your revenues, which will be divided in broad heading: taxes, non-tax revenues, grants. These would be grants given, in the case of the government, by international donors. For example, the UK Department for International Development may make grants to the government of Somaliland. And any other receipts, these would be fees for things like land registry and so on. Showing your total revenue, in this case $400,000, and your planned expenditure, personnel costs, your payroll costs, the purchases of goods and services, the interest that you pay, any subsidies that you make, transfers, for example, to local governments, and any other payments that are made by the government that count as expenditure. And in this particular country X, it's very well placed, it actually has an operating surplus. It receives more than it spends. It's quite unusual for a government. It's quite nice if you're in that position. And it wouldn't matter whether you're using cash or accrual budgeting, although most countries would use cash budgeting, the format of that will look exactly the same. Now that's the budget presentation. The last thing we're going to look at is the requirement in the cash basis IPSAS and in the accrual IPSAS to have, as part of your financial reports each year, a comparison between the budget and the actual outturn. In the accrual IPSAS, it says an entity shall present a comparison of the budget amounts and actual amounts. The comparison of budgets and actual amounts shall be presented separately for each level of legislative oversight, that's to say central government and sub-national governments such as local governments, showing the original and final budgets. That means the original budget as enacted and the budget after any environments or supplementary budgets, and the actual amounts on a comparable basis. And that's emphasised in IPSAS 24 paragraph 31, which says all comparisons of budget and actual amounts shall be presented on a comparable basis to the budget. Now that's quite easy if you're using cash accounting, because they will be on a comparable basis, one hopes. If you're using accrual accounting but cash budgeting, it's a problem, which I'm not going to get into at this stage. We're talking about cash budget and cash accounting. That's the requirements both in IPSAS 24, so the paragraph references to IPSAS 24, but it is also the requirement in the cash basis IPSAS as well. And this is how you might present that. It does not specify in the IPSAS how you should present it, but this would be an acceptable presentation. Again, we show exactly the same budget items as we had before, but now what we're showing is the original budget, the final budget after, say, environments and any supplementary budgets that might be enacted, the actual outturn for the year, the figures in the accounts for 2015. Now you can then show the difference either between the original budget or the final budget. The IPSAS allows you the option. In this case, we show the difference between the final adjusted budget and the actual outturn in the final column. The differences, or you might like to call them the variances between budget and actual. You are required with a simple set of figures to be able to present that sort of information. As I said, this workbook is not very complicated compared to Workbook 4. We've looked at the nature and contents of the budget, the process of budget preparation, and we've looked in there also at a lot of the weaknesses in budget processes and how they can be rectified. The budget documents and a set of budget documents that would meet international requirements, and the IPSAS 24 and cash basis requirements